Good evening. The sigh of relief is universal. Everyone is feeling it. The rains are here. I'm Mthuli Ncube. Tonight on the program, we are going to be discussing the 2026 national budget, which is going to be presented by the Minister of Finance, Professor Mthuli Ncube, at the end of the month. And to discuss that, the expectations, is the CEO at the CEO Africa Roundtable, Mr. Kipson Gundani. Mr. Gundani.
Thanks, Guthrie. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's been a minute, yeah?
Sure, it has been a while.
Yeah. The Minister of Finance, Treasury officials, the MPs, and other stakeholders are gathered in Bulawayo for the pre-budget consultation meetings. And the nation also would want to have an input, but obviously through people like you, what we should expect or what should be in that budget to address certain concerns and considerations that are actually coming from the populace. The key issue is we have seen that the US dollar transactions are quite dominant in the economy. Therefore, people expect the budget to be indexed in US dollars. Should it be the case?
Thank you, Guthrie. You are asking a very pertinent question, which I think is in the minds of every progressive citizen of this country. So you discover that the minister faces a very serious policy quagmire in terms of signaling which currency route the country should take. I think of late there have been calls, particularly in the public corridors, that we need to de-dollarize by 2030. So if the minister is going to index the budget to the US dollar, it's a tacit admission to say the de-dollarization is just a mantra. All right. However, he also faces reality in the face that the bulk of transactions in this economy are US dollars. So what choice, therefore, does he have in choosing the right currency to do? Judging from the economic reality, the bulk of the revenues that the government is collecting is US dollars, the bulk of their expenditure is US dollars. So it makes sense for the minister, therefore, to present the budget just right in US dollars and avoid the indexing. The indexing has got one challenge. It has got a challenge that if the exchange rate moves, now we don't feel it because it's a bit stable. But if the exchange rate moves, it also naturally translates that the targets also move. And that can also perhaps send a signal of instability within the exchange rate and other macroeconomic variables. So my submission is, there is a populist stance to say, let's index, but let's present our budget in the ZIG so that at least we conform to the 2030 de-dollarization agenda. But reality on the ground, the bulk of the transaction are US dollars. They are collecting revenues in US dollars and they are spending in US dollars. So it makes sense to just present a budget in US dollars.
So are you likely to see the trend continuing even as we near the 2030 multi-currency use deadline? Because I have not seen anything slowing down in terms of the dominance of the US dollar transactions.
So the 2030 de-dollarization agenda, Guthrie, is another world discourse, which require another episode to talk about, because it has got its own issues. Mm-hmm. Realistically speaking, judging from what is obtaining today, I think the 2030 de-dollarization goal is far-fetched. And also talking to players in the industry, there are lingering fears surrounding that. My submission actually would be to untime this agenda and perhaps be preoccupied in getting the fundamentals right. And one such key fundamental is the confidence issue, which unfortunately you cannot work overnight. It's a process of successive good policies over years, and thereby then talk about de-dollarization. Otherwise, we are actually sending the economy into some form of dislocation as the economic agents take positions in fear of the unknown. No one really knows what is going to happen post the use of the US dollar, what is going to happen to your debts level, what is happening to your contracts and all those kind of things. Those remain questions unanswered. And I would also like to submit that in this 2026 national budget, the minister has got a responsibility to provide direction to this de-dollarization mantra, because it's actually causing the economy to go into some form of disequilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Talking about that, how crucial is it for the minister to also give direction as to how the government is going to be tackling the rising domestic debt?
So this is a time bomb, Guthrie. Traditionally, when the Treasury incurs fiscal deficits, they had always monetized this deficit through central bank accommodation. Unlike the situation now, the RBZ is pursuing a very tight stance on contractional monetary policy, and they are not giving room for fiscal accommodation. So what has happened? Rising domestic debt it's primarily due to Treasury failure to meet its obligations, particularly to suppliers to government. It has got a serious consequence in that it kills the industry. It's as good as they are supplying the goods to the market and they're not being paid for. What simply means is that you cannot continue to produce. So that's a time bomb that we need to deal with. The other catch area surrounding domestic debt, you find that the government gave its creditors, domestic creditors, some TBs. Most of these TBs have matured. Some have been rolled over, some have not. It also sends a very negative signal to the well-being of our markets and the continuity of the stabilities associated with public expenditures. If this trend continues like that, obviously we'll get to a boiling point where the domestic debt is so huge that the government can't pay it, and also in the absence of RBZ fiscal accommodation, what it only means is we have got a lot of enterprises that will go broke, yet they are sitting on a very huge debtors book, and that debtor is government.
Sure. Please join us in the second segment as we discuss the expectations in the 2026 national budget, where the Minister of Finance, Professor Mthuli Ncube, would be expected to meet the expectations of everyone. I don't know how possible is it. Join us in the second segment. Welcome back. This week we are with the CEO of the CEO Africa Roundtable, Mr. Kipson Gundani, who is also a qualified and well-renowned economist. We've been discussing, and we continue to discuss, the 2026 national budget, which is going to be presented at the end of the month by the Treasury boss, the Minister of Finance, Professor Mthuli Ncube. Mr. Gundani, a lot of people were happy with the indications by the Minister of Finance when he said that he would consider the integrated mediated transfer tax, IMTT.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people, they're saying, Minister, it's important just to scrap it off. But the Minister is saying, okay, if I scrap it off, it means I have to look at increasing the value-added tax. What would be the impact of scrapping the IMTT?
So, Guthrie, before introduction of the IMTT, the VAT was already 15%, and it is still 15%.
Mm-hmm.
And also, let's look at the rationale why the IMTT was introduced in the first place. The argument then by the minister was, we have got a very huge informal economy, which is transacting also via mobile money platforms, and some they are banking, but their activities are very much informal. in order to capture them, let's see, issue a transaction-based tax, where at the point of transacting your tax, the whole idea was to capture the informal economy into the tax bracket. Of late, there's increasing evidence and reality that the informal sector has become predominantly cash-based. Nobody banks there. All right? So you are no longer capturing the intended group of people that you intended to capture in the first place. So what it has tended to happen is to say the same people that are paying the corporate tax, the same people that are using the formal system to do their business, which you call the informal economy, right, is the one that is feeling the brunt of the IMTT tax. And what makes the IMTT tax very pervasive is that it is transaction-based. So it is a cost to production. All right? It is your cost to acquiring the basic necessities that you need to produce. At every point of payment, they are charged that. And this is, to me, a pervasive tax. It does not support growth. It does not support production. Looking at the numbers, I think the Treasury is collecting close to $500 million from IMTT tax. And I know that is sweet. And the conventional economics tell us of what is called the replacement effect. Mm-hmm. Right? In the terms of crisis, governments may introduce new taxes like what they did to IMTT. But once the normalcy, the tax effect, there is zero reluctance by the government to go back to the old normal. The new normal becomes the normal. So the IMTT tax in the eyes of the Treasury is a new normal. They are loving it. They are collecting $500 million to it, but they are not considering the direct impact that it has on the productive sector.
Mm-hmm. So your submission is that it has outlived its usefulness in terms of its intent.
We have been saying this all along to say, Honorable Minister, just to do the honorable thing. Remove the IMTT because it has not captured your intended objective.
Okay. And then that's the impact on the IMTT. Retaining it, that's what it does to business.
Sure.
But to government...
Of course, it's extra revenue.
Extra revenue.
Yeah.
So if the government were to scrap it and increase VAT, what would be the effect on business, the same business that you're talking about?
Guthrie, the challenge that we have in this country is we've got so many tax heads. VAT is just one of them, but it's not the only tax that businesses are faced with. It's not the only tax that you, as a citizen of this country, is faced with. Increasing VAT would be just increasing the effective tax rate of this country. And the tax, naturally, is a leakage. In the economy, it downgrades what we call aggregate demand, and it does not stimulate production. I would argue in any day that perhaps the minister is high time you consider a single tax for the entire industry that we can religiously pay. If you can say just out of all your revenues you submit 20%, I think that's a smarter way of doing it instead of tweaking around so many taxes that at the end of the day are also very expensive to administer. So I think the tax issue is a whole area that needs a proper analysis and evaluation so that we come up with the effective tax rate for this country. Otherwise, the general perception at the moment is we're a highly taxed country, and that is not good for production.
Mm-hmm. We have seen the government, through cabinet approvals, either merging certain taxes or scraping them off completely. But obviously, they've got to be supported by the relevant legal instruments, the statutory instrument, which many people have actually said that they take long to craft, and therefore there's no change. But do you believe that we are going towards that single tax that you are clamoring for?
We could, but referring to what you're talking about, I think there have been calls on particular the regulation fees and levies by the various quasi-government authorities and regulatory authorities, and commendable. I think the government hit the call, and they are making baby steps towards achieving that. But like you said, it requires a legal backing for them to take, to be effective, and that tends to take longer. And naturally, governments, I'm not referring to the government of Zimbabwe alone. Naturally, governments are greedy. The reluctance and the speed at which this is happening, obviously not as swift as it ought to be. But you might actually discover that perhaps the regulatory agencies were collecting significant revenues than the treasury itself. So it makes sense to look at the mixture of those regulatory fees and levies, possibly reduce them, so that at least you can also improve the ease and the cost of doing business in this country and stimulate economic growth. I think that is the argument there. And we commend the government for taking heed of the call and for making those crucial initial steps towards resolving that.
Please join us in the final segment when we conclude this week's program, where we've been discussing with the CEO of the CEO Africa Roundtable, Mr. Kipson Gundani, the forthcoming 2026 national budget. Welcome back to those who have been with us from the beginning, and to those who are just joining us. We are at the closing stage of this week's program, where we have been discussing the 2026 national budget, what ought to be in it, what ought not to be in it, and what people would love to see in it, even if they're not thinking about, but which makes them merry during this festive season. And I've been in discussion with the CEO of the CEO Africa Roundtable, Mr. Kipson Gundani. Mr. Gundani,
sure.
We've spoken about the taxes, we've spoken about the issue of the rising debt, the local debt. We've spoken about the presentation of the budget. Should it be in USD or a ZIG index in US dollars? But for the ordinary person, for successive years, there have been that clamor for the government to be able to increase the tax thresholds, to give relief to the ordinary person, and in so doing, increase the aggregate demand that you spoke about in the economy. What would you love to see?
So, the minister has got a mammoth task. I know he's facing increasingly huge government expenditure, but at the same time, we cannot tax ourselves out of poverty. One tax hit that I would clamor the minister to look at is to review the pay-free threshold, which currently stands at plus or minus $90, if I'm not mistaken. And that's too low. In other words, we are taxing the very poor, and we are taking the much needed disposable income they require. So it's one tax hit which I would recommend the minister to strongly look at and consider raising the pay-free threshold to at least $200, so that at least the very lowly remunerated citizens of this country, they are not taxed in that regard. It's only fair to do so. Secondly, we have talked about the MTTT. My view is it has to be scrapped because it is also a tax as people transact. But more importantly, Guthrie, apart from the tax side, it's on expenditure reprioritization. Of late, there has been a commitment by the Treasury to repay debt, particularly foreign debt. Given our current revenue performance, this country currently has got no capacity to do so. And the token payments that we are doing won't extinguish the debt because the debt is growing at a rate faster or huge than the token payments that we are doing. So instead, I would recommend the minister to continue pursuing the structured dialogue that is having with creditors, with the hope of renegotiating towards restructuring this debt and rescheduling part of it, so that at least the country has got a fresh start. Lastly, the main challenge that we have in this country is production. So I would want to see the minister coming up with an avalanche of incentives that incentivize production, be it primary production or industry production, by incentivizing, for example, capital equipment inputs, and also by incentivizing exports, so that at least we can realize this dream of the export-led economic growth. I think there should also be significant incentives to try and stimulate value addition domestically. I'll give you the case of tobacco. We are exporting raw tobacco as a country, despite the billions plus that we are realizing. We've got the potential to multiply that by 15 times. The average price of a kg of tobacco in this country is $4. But when that tobacco is processed to the final product, the average price per kg of tobacco is $60. And that's 15 times more. Let's try now to move up the value chain so that at least we can continue to reap more. We have sorted the primary production. We are producing huge kgs, numerous tons of tobacco. The issue is to now move to the upper value chain, to the upper nodes of the value chain, so that we can realize more as a country.
Mm-hmm. There was a flirtation with the wealth tax, and then the authorities said they were not ready. But there are still others who are saying that, look, there is a growing gap, the inequality gap in this country. Why can't we try and level that up by reintroducing that or operationalizing that wealth tax? What's your view on that?
So the wealth tax is a complicated tax, all right? How do you tax me based on what? But I might have wealth, but not in physical cash, but in real physical assets. For example, buildings, houses, and all those kind of things. That does not necessarily translate in my ability to pay a wealth tax, because these are not liquid assets, all right? So it's a new issue that also requires a critical interrogation. I subscribe to the idea that the richer you are, the higher the tax you should pay. That is only fair to do so. But the mechanics of doing it needs to be sanitized, and also more importantly, Guthrie, the Gini coefficient in this country, the gap between the rich and the poor, is widening. Why? It is because of unbalanced policies. If you look at the period when we got independence in 1980, there was a very robust policy of growth points. The reason why growth points were doing is to pursue what we call balanced growth, right? If our policies favor the few, there is no way, whatever we do, we will continue to have this bushioning dichotomy between the rich and the poor. So we need perhaps to relook at our development matrix and reallocate resources in uplifting those sectors of the economy that are lagging behind.
You must be very wealthy and very rich, because the way you really tried to deal with it.
Not even.
It's always a pleasure, brother, having you on this program. I really appreciate it.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here always.
Sure. Let the relief continue, and we hope that there will be more rains. And more rains means life. And more rains means what? Means more production. And more rains means what? Means we're going to have a wet Christmas. Let it be wet. Good night.